John O'Keefe died in the snow outside a house full of cops. 3 years later, 2 trials, 1 acquittal, 1 dishonorably discharged investigator, and nobody has been charged with his murder. Nobody. So here's the thing about this case. I've covered a lot of true crime. A lot. And most cases, even the really dark ones, you can follow the logic of what happened. Someone did something, investigators found evidence, someone got convicted. This case is different. A Boston police officer, 16 years on the force, found dead in a front yard outside a party full of his colleagues. And after everything, the headlines, the protests, the HBO documentary, the courtroom drama, the hung jury, the retrial, the only person they ever went after was his girlfriend. The woman who drove back at 6 a.m. in the freezing dark to look for him. The woman who found him lying in the snow. The woman who called for help. They charged her with his murder. She was acquitted.
And John O'Keefe's death is still officially unsolved. No suspect, no arrest, no answer. This is the Karen Read case, and it is one of the most disturbing things I have ever looked into. Let's start from the beginning. January 28th, 2022. Karen Read is 44 years old. She's an equity analyst. She teaches finance at Bentley University, which is where she went to college. She's been dating a guy named John O'Keefe for about 2 years. John is a Boston police officer, 16 years on the force. He's 46. Here's the thing about John O'Keefe that I think gets lost in all of this. His brother and sister-in-law died, and John took in their kids. Just took them in. Built his life around raising them. That's who this man was.
So on the night of January 28th, John and Karen go out drinking in Canton, a suburb outside Boston. They go to a couple of bars with a group of people. As the night winds down, the plan is to head to a house party at the home of a retired Boston police officer named Brian Albert. This is a work social, John's crowd, John's colleagues, people from his world. Karen drives them over. They arrive at 12:24 in the morning, and within a few minutes, Karen leaves. Now this is where the two sides split immediately and never come back together. The prosecution says there was an argument. Says Karen hit John with her SUV and drove off. The defense says Karen wasn't really invited. This was a cop gathering. John went in, Karen went home.
Karen gets home. She calls John a few times. He doesn't pick up. She figures he fell asleep at the party. Goes to bed. By 6 in the morning, John still isn't home. Not answering. Karen gets in her car. Picks up 2 friends, goes back to Fairview Road. They find John lying in the front yard, face down in the snow. He's been out there for hours. He has injuries on his arm, cuts on his head. He's unresponsive. He never wakes up.
Here's where this story goes from tragedy to something else. The lead investigator assigned to the case is a Massachusetts state trooper named Michael Proctor. And almost immediately after being assigned, Proctor starts texting people. Not about the case. Well, about the case. But not in the way you'd expect from an investigator. He's texting his wife, his family members, people connected to the Albert household. And the messages he's sending, they later come out in court, are personal, derogatory, and one-sided. From the very beginning of this investigation, Proctor is talking about Karen Read like she's already guilty, using language about her that you wouldn't use about a suspect in a professional context. Michael Proctor wasn't some random trooper who got assigned this by chance. He had personal ties to the Albert family. Brian Albert, the man who owned the house where John O'Keefe died, was not a stranger to Proctor. Their families knew each other. So the lead investigator on this case personally knew the family who owned the house where the victim was found. And from day one, he went after Karen Reed. Only Karen Reed. Nobody inside that house was treated as a suspect. Nobody inside that house had their phones seized the way they needed to be. Nobody inside that house was interviewed with the level of scrutiny that Karen Reed got.
So what did the prosecution actually have? 3 things. First, Karen's taillight. Her Lexus SUV had damage to the right rear taillight, and pieces of red plastic from that taillight were found in John O'Keefe's clothing. Prosecution says she backed into him in the dark, hit him with the rear of her car, drove away. Second, the injuries on John's body. The medical examiner said his arm injuries were consistent with being struck by a vehicle. Third, things Karen said at the scene. When they found John in the snow, Karen was in shock and panicking. She made statements that prosecutors later argued suggested she knew she'd hit him. That's their case. And on the surface, it sounds like something. But then the defense starts talking.
The defense had one thing in particular that stopped everyone cold: a Google search. On the night John O'Keefe died, a woman named Jennifer McCabe, a friend of the Albert family, someone who was at that house, searched something on her phone. Hawes longed to die in cold. That's not a typo I'm making. That's actually what was typed. Hawes. As in, someone typed it fast, in the dark, on a phone. The defense's argument? That search was made in the early hours of that morning, before John O'Keefe was found. If that's true, then someone in that house already knew John O'Keefe was lying outside in the cold, dying, before anyone called for help. The prosecution pushed back hard. They said the metadata on the phone proved the search was made later, after the body was discovered, after Karen arrived. The defense brought in their own experts, who said the metadata had been manipulated, or was unreliable, or was misread. And then the prosecution brought in counter-experts. This one Google search, this one typo on a phone, became the single most contested piece of evidence in the entire trial. People online have spent years on this, and they still don't agree. Then, the defense brought up the dog. Brian Albert had a dog, a big dog, and the injuries on John O'Keefe's arm, the ones prosecutors said came from Karen's car, a defense expert looked at them and said, "Those look like dog bites. The shape, the depth, the pattern, inconsistent with a vehicle strike, consistent with a large dog." So now the defense is building an alternative. John O'Keefe went into the house. Something happened inside. Maybe a fight, maybe the dog got to him. However it happened, John ended up outside in the snow, dying. And the people in that house, many of them connected to law enforcement, did nothing. And then they framed Karen Reed for it. That's the defense theory. The prosecution said it was fantasy, that 11 witnesses and cell phone GPS data all confirmed John O'Keefe never entered that house. 2 completely different nights, same address. The first trial started in April 2024. Months of testimony. Michael Proctor got on the stand. And whatever the prosecution hoped would happen, it didn't. Because under cross-examination, Proctor had to admit the texts. He had to admit the language he used about Karen Reed. He had to acknowledge that from the beginning of this investigation, he had formed a view and worked from that view. He said it didn't affect his work. The jury didn't come to a unanimous decision. Hung jury. Mistrial. They had to do the whole thing again. Before the second trial, something significant happened. Michael Proctor was brought before a Massachusetts State Police misconduct hearing, and in March 2025,
Just weeks before the retrial started, he was dishonorably discharged. The man who led the investigation into John O'Keefe's death, the man who sent those texts, the man who from day one treated Karen Reed as the only suspect. Dishonorably discharged. Unsatisfactory performance. Alcohol on duty. The prosecution made a decision. They would not call Proctor to the stand in the second trial. They left him out entirely.
The second trial started April 2025. The defense this time was even sharper. They dropped the third-party culprit argument, not because they didn't believe it, but because the judge ruled they couldn't formally present it to the jury without enough foundational evidence developed at trial. So instead, they hammered one thing: reasonable doubt. You don't know how those injuries got on his arm. You can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. You can't explain that Google search. You can't trust the foundation of this investigation when the lead investigator was just dishonorably discharged. 8 weeks. On June 13th, the jury got the case. 4 days of deliberations. At one point, the jury sent a note saying they'd reached a verdict. Everyone rushed to their seats. Then, the jury sent another note. They weren't ready after all. Back to the room. On June 18th, 2025, not guilty of murder. Not guilty of manslaughter. Not guilty of leaving the scene. Guilty of one thing: drunk driving. 1 year of probation. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of people screaming. Karen Reed walked out and signed "I love you" in American Sign Language to the crowd. June 2026, nearly a year after the acquittal, Karen Reed filed a civil lawsuit against Massachusetts State Police and the Canton Police Department. Her lawyer said the goal isn't really about money. He said what Karen wants cannot be written on a check. She wants exposure. She wants the corruption that she says runs through Massachusetts law enforcement to be out in the open, on record, undeniable. She's calling out Michael Proctor and former Canton Police Sergeant Sean Good. She says they were biased, derogatory, and completely unfit to investigate the death of John O'Keefe. Canton has pushed back, defended how they handled it, said they launched their own internal investigation. This lawsuit is still going.
Here's what I keep coming back to. John O'Keefe is dead. He died on a front lawn in Canton, Massachusetts in January 2022. A man who took in his brother's kids, who showed up for people, who gave 16 years to the job. He died in the snow. And somewhere along the way, this stopped being about him. It became about Karen Reed. Then it became about corruption. Then it became about sides. Pro-Karen, anti-Karen, the Alberts, the state police, the texts, the Google search, the dog. And John O'Keefe, the reason any of us are here, got buried under all of it. Nobody has been charged with his murder. Nobody is publicly under investigation. His death is officially unsolved. Not cold, not paused, unsolved. And I'm not sure anyone with the power to change that is still asking the question.
What are your thoughts about this case? Comment below. Not for the verdict, not for Karen, not for the corruption story. For the man who died in the snow and still doesn't have an answer. Subscribe, because this story isn't over, even if it feels like everyone moved on.